So I started making a full review video over the Canon R5C, but then I realized that there was just too much to cover to put it in just that one video. That rushed. I've only had a few days with the camera, and I wanted to use the camera a little bit longer before I made that full video over it. So in this video, we're going to compare it to my RED Komodo from an image quality standpoint. And they're both kind of aimed at the same market with that RF mount and the RAW capabilities. So some quick specs before we get started here. The RED Komodo is a $6,000 camera that shoots 6K RED RAW, and that's up to 40 frames per second on the full sensor readout. And then you have the Canon R5C that just finally came back in stock, which is a full frame camera that shoots 8K RAW internally. And that's at a $4,500 price point. And then if you want to shoot a compressed codec on either one of these cameras, they both have their own flavors of 422 10-bit codecs. The Komodo uses the standard ProRes 422 HQ 4K codec, and then the Canon R5C has quite a few different flavors, but the one I ended up using with the Canon R5C was the 422 10-bit all-intra codec, which is shooting at around 410 megabits per second. As a cinematographer and filmmaker, I want to see how these cameras perform in more of that type of environment, an environment that I might actually light and set up for something that would actually be shooting like commercial or a film. So I threw on my Mica 50mm cinema lens, a moment variable ND filter, and then I set up this little shot in my kitchen so I could have some high dynamic range to work with here. I've got the windows in the background, and then I used a aperture 120D with a 4-foot softbox to key my face, to light my face, to balance the image out. So to make things easy, I started with the compressed 10-bit codecs in these cameras. And what's really great about both these cameras is they both have, larger, higher resolution sensors that are going to oversample when you shoot in 4K. So the Komodo is oversampling from the 6K, and the R5C is oversampling from the 8K. And so this allows us to get a much higher dynamic range and more detail even on that 4K compressed image. Now the Canon R5C limits you to the Canon C-Log3 profile, which is a little bit less dynamic range than the C-Log2 profile that you're able to access from the RAW files in post. But the RED, of course, just uses its regular RED log, and you can use that on both codecs. So the first thing you'll notice is obviously there's going to be pretty big color differences. They both, both sensors react differently, and both the log profiles are going to react differently. So when converted to Rec. 709, the Komodo tends to lean a little bit green. It kind of always has. It's kind of always been a kind of staple of RED. Whereas the Canon seems to be very neutral. It has that really nice Canon color science that leans a little bit more blue, a little bit more clean, and that Komodo is just a little bit green. That green has never really been an issue for me, but it is nice that if you're just trying to get something that's just quick out of camera, like everyone's always said, the Canon's the easiest to do that. Of course, these images are pretty clean from a noise perspective because we're shooting at the native ISO, and then we are oversampling from the bigger sensors, and there's going to be a little bit of noise reduction applied to those 10-bit codecs. I realize that these close-ups aren't perfectly in focus, but it's the best I could do when shooting by myself. So after that, of course, I wanted to test out the RAW capabilities of these cameras. Now, I think a lot of people are going to be kind of scared of the RAW coming out of the R5C because the data rates are so high. And that's because of the usual conundrum with RAW cameras, and the fact is RED has their own patent on RAW compression. So even shooting RED RAW in the medium or high quality on the RED Komodo, from what I can tell, the data rate shouldn't ever exceed 300 megabits per second. And you're still going to retain a lot of that RAW quality. Whereas when you're shooting with this Canon, even in the light Canon RAW mode, the 8K or even the 6K is going to be well above that 300 megabits per second. Actually, the 8K full frame at 24 frames per second is well over 1,000 megabits per second. So you're going to need some hard drives if you want to shoot on the Canon R5C in RAW, but that might be worth the sacrifice once you see these images. So I was shooting medium quality 24 frames per second, 6K on the Komodo, with my Canon speed booster on the front to give it a full frame equivalent. And then we're shooting 8K RAW in the LT, the light RAW codec on the Canon R5C. I then did use C-Log2 as my profile in the end on the Canon to get more dynamic range to see how that looks. And you can tell here they're both pretty noisy images. That is to be expected with a RAW file. I was trying to save those highlights in the back there, so the shadows are a little bit noisy. But what's great about these RAW files is you get so much more detail back in the image. You're getting that 6K resolution or the 8K resolution, and then you're keeping all that detail from the RAW files. And then of course I needed to see what it would look like if I cleaned up that noise, so I added just a smidge of noise reduction to both of these shots to clean them up, and the noise went away with no problems. The color curves here are very different. It seems that the Canon is just a little bit more lifted than the Komodo. It seems like the Komodo is just a lot more compressed down in that lower end of the sensor, something that's always been pretty common with RED cameras, and a lot of these other modern cameras tend to have a little bit more push in the midtones. Definitely like if you're shooting on something like an Arri Alexa, there's gonna be a lot more lift right there in the midtones. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when exposing for these cameras. I also threw a quick grade on here to see how they would look, and they both kind of match up a lot easier that way, and the colors look really nice. And then if you compare it to the internal 4K codecs, that's when you're gonna have a little bit more of a baked in color, a little bit less natural looking. I really just prefer raw images because they just look a little bit more organic. There's just a lot more color there that your eye can perceive, and it just looks more realistic to me. I know for a lot of people, raw might be overkill, but for me, I always want to buy a camera that has that option in it. As a commercial cinematographer, I want to be able to give the best image quality possible if the client requests it. So both of these cameras are great for that. You can simply shoot in a 4K codec for a quick turnaround, a 10-bit codec that you can quickly and easily edit. Or if you want that higher quality, if you're doing something that's like a national commercial or something that you just really want to have the best image quality possible, then it's great that both these cameras come with those raw capabilities. And that's what I was most interested when trying out the Canon R5C. So I have a few more quick thoughts on the Canon R5C. Before we jump into that, let's talk about today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to present your work online. If you're anything like me, if you're a cinematographer or a filmmaker, you're going to need to put your work somewhere online, and a website is a great place to do that. Squarespace gives you the ability to upload photos and embed video however you want from any platform of your choosing, and you can personalize the website however you want. And if you are using your website to get more work in the industry, the ability to build a custom contact form has been really helpful for me as a working cinematographer. Clients can fill out this form, and then that will be emailed to you, and you'll be able to see that there is a job inquiry coming in your inbox very easily because you can see that that form submission is coming from Squarespace. And I just really like this because it kind of helps curate when jobs come into my email inbox and it's not just spam or something like that. You can see that it says, Squarespace form submission, and you know that you're getting an inquiry through your website. So if you're looking to build a website right now, you can just do that with Squarespace. Click the link in the description to get 10% off, and I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Okay, so I'm extremely impressed with the Canon R5C, so much that I'm going to keep continuing using it for the next month or so. I'm going to be making probably one or two more videos over it and really testing it out and trying to use it as my cinema camera and see how it holds up. This is the first mirrorless camera in basically forever that I've really considered having in my kit. Now, I know I talked recently about getting the Sony a7 IV as my B camera, but the Canon R5C could just be your A camera, but I would love to have it as a B camera to my RED Komodo, as something that I can pick up and just walk around and use, or fly on a gimbal, or maybe even just use as my A camera. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in some other videos after I test it out a little bit more and see if it's actually worth it for me in that regard. There's just a lot to love about the Canon R5C over my RED Komodo. The fact that it's actually full frame, I don't have to speed boost it to get it there. It can shoot up to 60 frames per second in RAW, which is on the Komodo I'm gonna have to crop in if I wanna get past 40 frames per second. I don't use autofocus very often, but it does have great autofocus that I could maybe use if I needed to. And also it has a dual gain sensor, so it actually shoots at 800 ISO as its native, but it also can jump up to 3200 ISO if you're in need of a little bit more of a boost in some lower light situations. Whereas the Komodo is definitely gonna fall apart in the lower light scenarios. Okay, so these are just my first tests with the Canon R5C versus the RED Komodo, but there'll be more videos coming up soon over the R5C, so subscribe if you wanna see those, and like this video if you found it helpful. That goes a long way for me on the channel. And as always, I'm Spencer Sakurai. See ya.